Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. Welcome to today's webinar on elevating core instruction through 7 models of co-teaching. My name is Leanne Young. I'm Chief Academic Officer for ASCD Student Growth Center. ASCD Student Growth Center is a partnership with ASCD in which we provide support to schools, to districts, to teachers in the area of providing interventions to students who have disabilities or students who are behind grade level and don't have disabilities. This is our contact information. You can find us online at studentgrowth.org. Here is my email address, and you can follow us on Twitter at these handles. During this webinar, I'll identify 7 models of co-teaching that you can use to support learners within core instruction or within Tier 1 instruction. Really, it's 6.5 models. It's not exactly 7, and you'll understand why when I get to the 7th model of team teaching. We'll think about how these models of co-teaching fit within the features of response to instruction and intervention. So before I get to describing the 7 models of co-teaching, I'll describe the overall structure of response to instruction and intervention so that I can show you how we can bolster the quality of core instruction by using co-teaching. And finally, I'll give you a resource that you can use to identify examples of when each of these models could be effective in your classroom and give you a way to plan for using them purposefully. What I'd like for you to do first is think about, how does co-teaching look now? What do you think of when you think of co-teaching? When you envision a classroom that is using co-teaching, sometimes these are called collab classes, collaborative classes, collaboration classes. What do you think of as each of the teacher's roles? If you were to walk into that classroom, what would you see? Take just a minute, pause the video, and think about how this would look. As we think about co-teaching and tiers of instruction, it is important that we set the stage of all students belong to everyone. It's not that students who struggle belong to special education. Many students who struggle don't have disabilities, and many students who have disabilities don't require additional support. All students belong to everyone, and in a co-teaching environment, we see a general educator and perhaps a special education teacher or a reading specialist, a writing specialist, an ELL teacher, and it's not that only the students with disabilities belong to the teacher who is a specialist, and the students who are English learners belong to the EL teacher, or only the students who don't have disabilities or need additional support belong to the general educator. It's that all teachers in the classroom serve all students. Everyone belongs to all of us. This culture is an important one to set up in the beginning. As we think about co-teaching, it is important that we think about it within the framework of response to instruction and intervention. You may have heard of the tiers of support. You may be well versed on this. It is important to know that there are a lot of resources out there on response to instruction and intervention. There are books, there are articles, and some of them lean more heavily on the research base than others. It is important that you're seeking out resources that do lean heavily upon the researchers who developed response to instruction and intervention. You want to see articles and books that reference the Fuchs from Vanderbilt. You want to see the researchers who've developed it, because there are a lot of misconceptions out there, and many of them are in written materials that have been published. A couple of resources that you might want to use to extend your learning on response to instruction and intervention are the RTI Action Network and RTI for Success. Both of these online resources will provide you with hours and hours of free materials to extend your learning. As we think about the tiers of support, Tier 1 is the base of the triangle, because the base serves most students, actually Tier 1 serves all students, and for most students, that's enough. What is offered in core instruction, if core instruction is strong and evidence-based, this is sufficient for students to succeed and to excel. Some students require more than what's offered in core instruction in order to succeed on one or more skills. For many of these students, small group instruction offered a couple of times, 3 times a week at 30 to 45 minutes is sufficient for them to gain that skill and then no longer need intervention. This type of intervention is called Tier 2 instruction. You'll see in some articles and books clear lines of what percentage of students receive Tier 1, receive Tier 2, receive Tier 3, and really that's a bit of a misinterpretation. The notion of what percentage of students and even how many students are in a small group and how many minutes per day or week they receive intervention really should be descriptive, not prescriptive. It was not designed to prescribe how many students in any given classroom or school should receive each type of intervention. For some students, Tier 2 instruction is not enough. They require intensive intervention, either individually or with 1 or 2 other students more frequently. So it may be every day for an hour, 45 minutes, that the students receive intervention on a skill. This can be very short term or it can extend longer term. Response to instruction and intervention, RTI, now has 2 I's. It's RTII, and that's because it is response to instruction and intervention. And the idea is that we want to really attend to our core instruction, what all students get, before we think about what interventions are needed for students for whom core instruction didn't work. That makes sense, right? We want to have the best quality core instruction to prevent the need for additional interventions. One of the myths is that Tier 3 is special education. And that's not the case. If we suspect a student has a disability and we have evidence to show that the student may have autism, for example, we proceed with evaluation. We don't go through tiers of instruction before we make that referral. We may use this process for students who have suspected learning disability, though, and that's because a student who is behind in reading, for example, and that student who's behind has a learning disability, that student is going to look very similar to a student who's behind, but maybe they had poor kindergarten instruction. We can't tell the difference between the students until we implement high-quality, evidence-based intervention and can take a look at how students respond. We have evidence that a student has a neurological difference if the student is requiring intensive, long-term intervention in order to be successful. But Tier 3 is not special education. There are many students who need intensive individual intervention in order to gain a skill but don't have a disability. In fact, most students who are behind grade level do not have a disability. So Tier 3 does not equal special education. Most students who have disabilities don't need support for always or for everything. Some students who have disabilities may require intervention for even a couple of years or longer and then may not need intervention in the future. So we can't assume that because a student has a disability, they'll always need an intensive level of intervention, because that's simply not the case for most students. Also, Tier 2 is not where we go with every difficulty. If students are struggling and requiring additional support, it may be that we're not needing to figure out how to deliver additional Tier 2 intervention. It may be that we need to be bolstering the quality of our core instruction, improving our universal design for all learners. There are not Tier 2 or Tier 3 students. To say that there's a Tier 2 student or these are our Tier 3 students implies that those students are going to require that intensive level of intervention or small group intervention permanently or all year. And that's not the way that response to instruction and intervention is designed. Tier 2 instruction may be delivered for 6 weeks, and then the student no longer requires that intervention. So there are students who have skills that require Tier 2 or Tier 3 levels of support, but there are not Tier 2 students or Tier 3 students. All students are Tier 1 students, and some students have skills that require additional support. There are 2 types of learning differences. We can think of learning differences as being either neurological in nature. There's a difference to the brain structure. So students who have certain diagnoses have neurological differences. Students who have specific learning disabilities, students who have autism, students who have intellectual disability have neurological differences that explain some of the differences that they're experiencing academically. Other students have environmental reasons that are contributing to their learning differences. These students may have missed out on, they may have interrupted formal education. So a student may be a refugee who missed out on months of school or years of school. A student may have moved from school to school and experienced many different types of curricula and having trouble because of those changes. A student may have had poor instruction and be what Doug Fisher would refer to as an instructional casualty. So the student may have had poor instruction. There are also a variety of home factors that can be either helpful and promote and are protective factors, and there are other environmental factors at home that can be risk factors. The good news is it doesn't matter why the student is experiencing a learning difference. The tiered approach that we use, the structure for making decisions about how we support students and serve them, is identical. It doesn't matter if it's because of a diagnosis or because of an environmental factor. We still use the same tiers of instruction to support learning. Students then flow in and out of support based on how they're performing on a skill. It's not that a student who requires support now has in their schedule all year for an intervention necessarily. In fact, most students who require support require it for a skill and then no longer need it. We all struggled with something in school. There was something that every one of us could have used additional support to learn, but that didn't mean we needed it all the time and forever. We needed it for a particular skill, and that's the case for most students. Even for most students who have disabilities, that's the case. As we think about core instruction, and this is the piece of instruction that can be improved, can be strengthened via co-teaching, core instruction is not business as usual. Core instruction means that we, in an RTII model, in that framework, it means that we attend to universal design. It means that we have universal screening, that we are using evidence-based practices with all students for teaching skills. And it means that we frequently measure progress for all students so that we're attentive to students' performance on skills and that we respond before there is a massive gap. Oregon RTII talks about how as schools move toward this framework, year 1 is tier 1. And this means we invest a lot of efforts into improving our core instruction. We put a whole lot into that effort before we think about how do we improve our interventions. It may be that we don't need to improve a lot of our interventions if we improve our core instruction, and so that's why much of our efforts go to improving core instruction first. One of the keys to improving core instruction is by using co-teaching, by bringing the expertise of all teachers, bringing the expertise of general education and special education or another specialist into core instruction so that all students benefit from both both vantage points of teaching. So we can see from this example that this school really has embraced the idea that all students belong to everyone. The learning support teacher isn't there just to provide support to those students who qualify for special education services, but that both teachers are there to support anyone. So let's think through the 7 models of co-teaching, and then I'll show you an additional video of the last model, which really is a blend of the other 6. In One Teach, One Assist, one teacher has the primary responsibility for leading the lesson, while the other teacher assists students. In this model, it may sound like this is what you described earlier, when one teacher is teaching and the other teacher is helping the students who have IEPs. It's not, though. The difference is in One Teach, One Assist, the two have co-planned the lesson. They've purposefully chosen this model, and the teacher who's assisting is assisting any student who needs support, not only those students who have IEPs. Also, in One Teach, One Assist, it could be either teacher taking the primary role for teaching the lesson. It may be that a special education teacher is teaching a lesson that day while the general education teacher assists. As we implement One Teach, One Assist, we want to remember that this means, sorry to use a basketball analogy, but being from Kentucky, it seems appropriate, that we want to use zone defense, not man-to-man defense. So it's not that the person who is in the role of assisting at that moment, that person's not serving like a paraprofessional. That person is there to support a skill, and any student who needs support with that skill can gain assistance from that teacher. I know that one of you is in early childhood, so let's say this is really young children. We're talking about preschoolers. Instead of a person who's there to assist following a student around from area to area in the classroom, it may be that person is assigned to the block area or to the art area or to a workstation, rather than assigned to a person. So it's always zone defense, not man-to-man. In some ways, this is also a cultural issue. We want there to be a culture of inclusion, and we don't want a student who has an IEP to have. We don't want the students in the classroom to assume that person needs this adult to support them all of the time. That's not really accurate and not best use of that person's time. One Teach, One Observe is the second model of co-teaching. And in this model, one person has the primary instructional responsibility while the other person observes. Again, the person who has the primary responsibility for teaching could be the general educator, or it could be the special educator. It could be that the special educator has this fantastic graphic organizer that he's using with all of the students who are having difficulty with the initiating writing. Maybe this is a group of 4th graders, and there's a small group of students who's really struggled every year, it seems, with initiating writing. And so this year, he's going to bring that strategy into core instruction. So instead of it being a Tier 2 strategy, a Tier 2 intervention strategy, now he's coming in and they're going to use One Teach, One Observe, where he delivers the lesson on using this graphic organizer for initiating writing, while the general educator observes the teaching of that lesson so she can use it in the future with her classes. This builds everybody's skills. It may be that the special education teacher is observing to gain skills in a content area. Perhaps the special education teacher, as often happens, is assigned to a new content area this year. And maybe that teacher is assigned to biology and has not been assigned to biology before. And maybe that teacher is observing the general educator to gain competencies in biology. So One Teach, One Observe can help build both teachers' skills. Also, the observation, the target of observation isn't always the other teacher. It may be that one teacher has the primary instructional responsibilities, and the one who's in charge of observing is observing students. Maybe that person is taking observational data of students to see, what did students understand, or how did students behave, or how did that work? And so observational data can be of the other teacher, it can be of students, either way, and either party can be responsible for the lead instructional role or the observing role. So a minute ago I said station teaching. I said there are some types of co-teaching that are often used in early childhood, but we may not use in upper grades. And station teaching is an example of that. So in station teaching, we see the co-teaching pair divide the instructional content into parts. So it could be 2 parts, 3 parts, there could be 4 stations, and each instructor takes one of the groups. There can be unmanned groups, so you may have a table of independent work, and you may have 2 manned stations. You may have 3. So let's say we have 4 stations. Let's say this is a group of 9th graders working on writing. And so we may have 2 stations that are manned, one by the general educator, one by the special educator. We have 2 independent stations. And it may be that one of those independent stations has more of an enrichment focus. Every student doesn't have to get to every station. You could assign what stations students go to. So you could give them tickets telling them which stations they're attending. You could use technology to divide up the groups so that they know what group they go to, and you organize it so that they rotate. And one of those stations may be supplemental instruction, which is another model of co-teaching. So one of those stations may be devoted to giving additional instruction on a skill with which some students are struggling. And one of the stations may be designed for more enrichment focus. And so all students may go to 3 stations. And in this model, nobody really notices where everybody goes. Everybody just knows they're going where they need to go. And then they rotate. Again, the special educator is not only seeing students who have disabilities, but any student who's needing additional support with that skill. In parallel teaching, each teacher instructs half of the students. The 2 teachers are teaching the same content and are teaching it in the same way. The only purpose of this is to reduce the group size. So you've got 2 teachers, and instead of one teacher teaching 20 students, you have each teacher taking 10. In this model, we are not dividing students by ability. We simply are dividing the group in half. We're simply doing this we may do this for content areas that are are concepts that are more difficult. And so the only benefit is by having smaller numbers of students in each group, and this allows us to check for understanding easier. It may make some students more comfortable in speaking up and being able to present any questions that they have, any concerns that they have in being able to grasp the content. Supplemental teaching, I alluded to a minute ago. This is when one teacher is working with students at grade level, and then for those students who need additional support, they also receive supplemental instruction on a content area. We can pair it. We can use this with parallel instruction. Actually, I should say we can use this with station teaching. With station teaching, that's the example I just gave a bit ago. We can embed supplemental teaching within station teaching. We would not, however, pull students from core instruction to receive supplemental instruction. So we would never, for the students who are struggling with reading, take them out of reading instruction to get reading at a lower level, reading instruction at a lower level. That's not supplemental teaching. That is replacement instruction, and it is not effective. When we take students out of core instruction, they've missed it. Even if they're 2 grade levels behind, we don't want to replace what's currently being offered to all students with something at a lower level. That's not differentiation. That is replacing instruction with lower level instruction. And students who receive intervention in that model never catch up. Alternative teaching is when each teacher takes the same content, but they teach it in a different way. They use their own flair. They have their own methods. Maybe there is a really difficult math concept and lots of students are having trouble grasping it. We might use alternative teaching for a couple of reasons. We might use it to test out which way works better. We might use it for students who we're not sure which way are they going to learn better. So each person delivers the same content with their own flair, and then the groups swap. So all students are getting the content in 2 different ways. So particularly useful if we're both wanting to reduce group size, but also be able to use multiple methods to teach the same concept so that it's more likely to work for everyone. We can see how this would prevent the need for Tier 2 instruction, right? So if we're delivering it in 2 different ways, we don't then have to deliver it one way, see for which students it didn't work, put them into Tier 2 instruction. Everybody gets exposed to the content in 2 different ways, so that maximizes our core instruction. It really builds the skills of our team too, because each teacher is learning the method that the other teacher uses to teach the same content. Oftentimes when I teach this, I say there's 6 models. They're kind of 7. So you'll see 6 or 7 models of co-teaching in the literature. And the reason I say sort of 6.5 or the 7th isn't quite a new model, but team teaching is when there's an invisible flow of instruction, no division of authority. Both teachers are actively involved in the instruction, in the assessment. You can't tell which teacher has which role. And the reason I have our little mind reader guys here on the screen is because that's kind of how it feels. You walk into the classroom and you can't tell which person is the special educator and which one is the general educator. Both people assume kind of both roles all the time. Team teaching is most likely to happen with a pair who gets along really well and has been working together for a long time. It takes some time to build this rapport, right? I mean, you can imagine if you're using the one teach, one observe model, it could be uncomfortable for a new pair to observe, one teacher to observe the other and give feedback, critical feedback. That's easier for some of us than others, and easier for some of us to receive than others. And so building the relationship, a collegial relationship where we can offer one another feedback and suggestions and constructive criticism so that we can both grow and ask for feedback and ask for criticism, it sometimes takes a pair a while. So when we're really investing in co-teaching, we have to remember the importance of relationships and just assigning people to content areas based on skills and convenience. Certainly that's a piece of it, but assigning people based on relationships can be as or more important often than even existing skill set, because the relationship has to be strong and productive in order for team teaching to really work well. So next what I'd like to do is show you a video of a pair team teaching, and you'll see in this video examples of lots of different models. So they are functioning as a team, but you'll see that they're using some of the other aforementioned models of co-teaching in this example. So we can see in this example, that that we really couldn't tell a difference between if they hadn't been introduced that way. It would be difficult to know which teacher was the general education teacher, which teacher was the special education teacher, as they both moved back and forth to help any student who needed it. So what I'd like to do next is show you the co-teaching and planning form that I linked earlier. But before I do that, I'd like to see if anybody has questions so far about the 7 models of co-teaching. What has been your experience with those models? Yes, we will record, send the recording out. I'll have to record the beginning of it because I forgot to hit record in the beginning, but I'll re-record the beginning of this webinar and we'll send it out so that people who missed it would be able to join in. And what might be helpful is if during that conversation with your team members, perhaps you bring the co-teaching planning form that I attached at the beginning. If you scroll to the top of the chat, you'll see a Dropbox link where you can download a Word document for planning each type of co-teaching. And what I would suggest is that you think about a skill that you normally teach, a lesson that you normally teach. Maybe you normally teach it as large group. Maybe it's a lesson on a skill for which a lot of students end up needing additional support. And so that's really where I would start. So in your teams, if you could, Jason's saying he doesn't see the link. I'll post it again. All right, there you go. There's the co-teaching and planning form. So, you know, perhaps you can take a lesson. Let's say that lots of students are struggling with factoring in math. And so, you know, perhaps that's something that's normally taught as large group. Everybody comes in, they learn factoring. For those students who are having trouble, they get sent to some sort of tier 2 experience for intervention. But we know that every year a group of kids has trouble with factoring, you know, and you can substitute any skill you can think of where every year 5 kids need additional support for that. And so I would take whatever skill that is, take a look at the way it's taught now. Because what we're trying to do is identify what are some of the things that we're teaching in Core 1 that we can teach in core instruction or Tier 1. What are some ways we can teach that and bolster the quality of that through co-teaching in order to prevent students from needing additional support? And often the answer is as simple as, hey, every year I send to you 4 students who need help with this. What are you doing with them? How do you help them eventually get it? What piece of that could we bring into my classroom to prevent as many students from needing that, or preventing them from needing as much Tier 2 intervention? And we can pull up this co-teaching planning form, and we can identify which one of the ways of co-teaching might be helpful. So it may be that we see, okay, 1 teach, 1 assist. You know, who is the instructor? Who is the assistant? What is the purpose of the assistance? How will that assistance look? And how will we assess learning? Station teaching, we can have as many rows as stations. We give the purpose of the station, the details, who's facilitating it, or is it an independent station? How will learning be assessed? For parallel teaching, we talk about the purpose and the methods of teaching it. Why are we teaching it in this way? What are the methods? Parallel teaching is, you know, we are using the same methods, but we detail what that would be. 1 teach, 1 observe. What's being taught? What's being observed? What's the purpose? Supplemental teaching, what is the skill being taught? What are the methods being used to teach it? Who are the students? Where is it being delivered? Supplemental teaching doesn't always have to be delivered in a separate setting. Supplemental teaching, as I mentioned earlier, can be snuck into a station teaching model. It can be delivered in the same classroom, but it is supplemental. It is in addition to core instruction. And to be clear, we want to use the least restrictive environment in order to deliver this type of instruction. So if we can deliver supplemental instruction during stations in the general education classroom, that's less restrictive than pulling students out. And then alternative teaching. Who's going to be teaching it? What's the purpose? What are the methods? And in this one, we would see that the methods would be different. We would have different methods across each instructor. So I hope that may provide a useful activity for you in your professional learning communities to identify skills, but use data. We don't want to just plan co-teaching to be planning co-teaching. Again, and that's why I started with instruction on response to instruction and intervention. The reason we're doing this is to prevent the need for higher levels of intervention. It is to bring instruction to the level of all learners. That's why we're doing co-teaching. It's just like technology. We don't just use technology for fun. It's just a tool. It has to have a purpose. And the same is true for co-teaching. It's not just for fun, but it's to prevent failure. It's to prevent the need for additional intervention or as much intervention. And so we want to use our data. And the data we have available to us can be gathered based on student work, student examples of student performance. For those skills that are requiring a lot of intervention, lots of students are needing to be pulled, or every year students are needing to be pulled to work on this. Those are the areas where we want to think about co-teaching. And I know that I've spent all of our time really thinking about academic interventions, but this is true for the behavioral side of MTSS as well. So within a multi-tiered system of support, response to instruction and intervention is one half of the triangle. The other half of the triangle is positive behavior and supports. Positive behavior support. So if we're seeing that a lot of students are having difficulty with a particular behavior, whether that is a disruptive behavior or difficulty with organization, for example, it could be any behavior, we can also implement co-teaching to support those behaviors as well. We've only got about 5 minutes left, but I would love to take your questions, your thoughts, your needs for additional support in being able to use and think about the 7 models of co-teaching and how they can be put to good use in your schools. And while we wait on people to post questions, I'll put up my contact information. Right. So there's my contact information again. And we'll send that out. We'll send contact information and the webinar to you. And then feel free, of course, to share the webinar with other people. And it may be a useful activity for you to watch the webinar or portions of the webinar with your PLCs, and then conclude by using the co-teaching planning form to think of ways that you might increase the quality of Core 1 as a team and be able to prevent the need for additional intervention. Videos that would illustrate each model. So I've shown you a couple of videos from the PDIF, PD in Focus from ASCD. They've just produced a special education course with me, and one of the modules is on co-teaching, where there is this information as well as additional video on co-teaching. I don't know of another resource where you can clearly see each model of co-teaching. Yeah, that's a good question, Tracy. So many general educators may not prefer to be in a co-teaching model? How can you show the benefit to their personal practice? I think one of the questions we have to ask is why. Why do they not want to be in a co-teaching model? Before we can really respond and be supportive of them, we need to have some understanding of why that may not be seen as desirable. It may be that they feel uncomfortable with showcasing their teaching to another educator. That can be uncomfortable if you've not had someone in your room, and you might feel judged. So it may be that that's the case. And so perhaps you could try offering a co-teacher for not all day, but a portion of the day where data indicate that additional support is needed. How do you measure the benefit of co-teaching? It can be expensive, but actually if we're investing a lot of effort into tier 1, into core instruction, you need less one-on-one intervention. You need less tier 2 small group interventions. So it's actually not as expensive as it sounds. It's an investment. Oregon RTII talks about year 1, tier 1, because they do recognize that, yes, you're taking people who would normally be delivering intervention and bringing them into core instruction. The benefit you see from that, though, is subsequently, not right away, but subsequently, fewer students need the much more expensive model of small group and one-on-one instruction. Yes, a lot of people feel that simply is team teaching or the one teach, one assist, but we didn't really plan for it kind of model. And again, for it to be co-teaching, it must be co-planned, co-instructed, co-assessed. Great. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to the 7 models of co-teaching. And I look forward to taking any questions you have via email and hearing how we can be of support. Thanks for joining us today.